Welcome to Anther Dish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. While the idea of community supported agriculture, or CSA farming, has become an established form of building more sustainable food systems in Canada, fish and aquaculture often seems to get left out of the equation. And yet there are many small-scale and independent fisheries working to procure sustainably caught and high-quality fish. So why aren't we looking more into how to help source fish more ethically and regionally? My guest today, Sonia Strobel, is here to explore this more. Sonia is the co-founder and CEO of Skipper Otto, a community supported fishery based in Vancouver, BC in Canada. Through her innovative sustainable seafood subscription model, members pre-purchase a share of the catch before the fishing season. This unique partnership between fishers and consumers guarantees harvesters a fair price for their catch, protects a traditional way of life in BC's coastal and Indigenous fishing communities, and disrupts a seafood system fraught with social and environmental injustice. Skipper Otto educates consumers about important issues in fisheries and the value of eating with the ecosystem while advocating for policy reform. Today we're exploring some of these vital themes, and she's sharing stories from her own family's fishery as well as the additional challenges faced by many Indigenous-owned fisheries in Canada. We speak about some of the main challenges facing the seafood industry in Canada amidst climate change and American tariffs, how Skipper Otto is navigating these challenges to support their fishing families, the proactive measures they are taking to increase transparency and build more sustainable fishery management, and the considerations that the public should bring in with them the next time they're out shopping for fish foods for dinner. Here's my conversation with Sonia. All right, welcome to the show, Sonia. How are you doing today?
Great, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited to chat with you. Do you mind giving those listening in a bit of a snapshot of who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
Absolutely. Well, my name is Sonia Strobel. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Skipper Otto. We're a community supported fishery. We're based on Coast Salish territory in what's known as Vancouver, BC. It's the territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Yeah, and so I'm really happy to join you and chat about community supported fisheries.
Me too. Yeah. So I know from when I was doing the research for this episode that you started Skipper Otto in 2008. Can you walk us through what the landscape of the seafood industry looked like in Canada at that time when you started?
Yeah, at that time, I had married into a fishing family about, eight years or so before that. And so before that, I didn't really actually know much about the fishing landscape, and I had grown up here, but hadn't grown up eating a lot of seafood. And that's kind of surprising thing to think about, living on the Pacific Ocean with some of the most abundant seafood in the world. And yet when you go into, your typical grocery store here, you don't find a lot of little fish. So at that time, when I kind of married in, I was part of community supported agriculture programs. I've been getting vegetables that way since the late 90s. I started joining CSA programs, and I really cared a lot about local food systems and that sort of thing. So found myself in a fishing family and just learning, just like, well, how does this work? And how do people harvest fish? And where does it all go? And realized that a lot of the problems that farming families face are the same problems that fishing families face in terms of, it's a very risky business to get into. It's very difficult to make, living wages. A lot of the local food that's produced goes away. It isn't eaten here. So I saw all these same kinds of problems. And what was interesting was that people were starting to really talk about agriculture. They were talking about food systems, but seafood was almost never mentioned.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Yet, seafood, as far as protein goes, it's one of the most, one of the lowest carbon proteins that we can eat. It's one of the best, local wild seafood is, one of the best ways to feed the world. And yet it's left out of the conversations. Not as much now, but boy, in 2008, this was not part of the conversation. People weren't asking where their seafood came from.
Which is so interesting because I come from a Irish farming family where they would have secret fishing holes and store their fish, right? So big fish family. But it's very interesting to see that kind of separation from agricultural farming production and seafood in Canada. And to me, it seems a little representative of how we tend to silo in Canada when we think about food systems to begin with. Can you speak a bit to that? In terms of the contemporary challenges, we certainly have a lot to navigate in Canada right now. So what are some of the challenges that the seafood system in Canada is facing as of 2025 onward?
Gosh, that's such a big question. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, fair.
It is. I mean, you're right. We really silo in Canada and food systems. We don't really think about the production of food is part of life. Like we producing food for one another is a way of life. It's we think of it as this kind of industrial system, and it really is the system that we have. It's kind of a holdover colonial system, if you think about,
Mm,
which is that, we had an imperialist power that came to Canada. There were pre-existing, robust, incredibly sustainable food systems here. In their place came a system of extraction, industrial scale extraction for profit. And so we have systems, structures, policies, logistics, all those things that are in place to extract a resource to sell somewhere else for shareholder profit. And so that's the system that we're dealing with here. And so with building a community supported fishery, doing that inside those structures, you're at every turn of the way you're up against a challenge because the system wasn't designed to feed people here. So we have a system where in Canada, we export about 90% of the seafood that we harvest
wow.
in this country. And
Wow.
of the seafood we eat in this country, about 80% of that is imported
Huh.
seafood.
Those are some pretty high numbers. I would have definitely guessed a lot lower than that. So that's a pretty staggering number. And has that number been consistent in the years that you've been, doing Skipper Otto, or has it kind of fluctuated with certain geopolitical events as well?
Yeah, it's a hard one to track in any kind of granular way. So it's something that we try to keep an eye on. We try to update those stats and see where they're going. But as far as we can tell, those are pretty static. They're not moving a lot. And those are some kind of a really big external industrial systems that are set up, and those are kind of hard to move those.
Yes, yes, very much so. So
Mhm.
I'm curious to hear a bit more about the idea of, what a community supported fishery can look like and, how does your work foster that sort of approach and those connections between the fishers and those that are eating the fish locally?
Mhm. Yeah. So in our community supported fishery model, we invite home cooks like you and me, rather than, wholesalers or independent individual or those kinds of institutional buyers. We invite home cooks to become part of a community. And to do that, they invest some money at the start of the season and say, this is how much fish I'd like to eat this year. It's up to them. Starting at $100, they can put in any amount that they want. And then that is a signal to our fishing families that they already have a fair market for their catch. They can untie from the docks. They know that they have that market already.
Mm,
And then our consumers, their members, can then pick and choose whatever they want, whenever they want from the catch. So they're getting updates to say who's fishing where and for what.
cool.
And then they can just log into the online store that they have special access to. They'll see their credit there, and then they can just shop, and it's just deducted from their credits. But that's so very different. And I think people don't often think about how different that is from the traditional industrial system. In the traditional industrial system, a fishing company will procure as much fish as they can at whatever low costs they can. And that
Uh,
sometimes comes at the cost of the environment and at people just to get that product in cheap. And then you go out and try to find a market for that at as much profit as you
uh,
can, right? So that's just a completely different way of thinking about a food system. Instead of saying, well, we would like to eat local seafood and we would like to harvest local seafood. Let's get into community together and we'll harvest for you. And then those members are saying, listen, we agree to eat with the ecosystem. So if this year is not an abundant sockeye salmon run, that's fine. There is plenty of other fish in the sea. Sorry, the pun, but there's so
yeah,
many. They
that's
happen accidentally.
hard to avoid.
Right? Yeah. But there's so much abundant, delicious, wonderful seafood. And so our members are pivoting. They're listening to fishing families who are listening to ecosystems. And we're able to feed ourselves, I think, some of the best food in the world by acting just a little bit different.
Oh, I love that. And it really, yeah, it does flip how you think about procuring food and even how that comes back into your house and how you cook it too. I'd imagine you're a bit more mindful of where it's coming from, who's bringing it to you as well.
Yeah. And if I can add one little thing, I remember I have
Oh,
this on my
yeah.
desk here. For those of anybody who might be watching us on video, all of our products come with a label like
Oh,
this.
awesome.
And so it has the face of who caught it and a little bio and how and when and where they caught it. So you really are getting that personal, direct connection and you're getting to know people personally. So we're really repairing. I think that's the difference, right? An industrial system breaks people apart because you can get away with all kinds of kind of fishy things. But when you reconnect communities, harvesters are incentivized. So like they're so proud, right? They want to
Mm.
handle this fish well and tell their stories, and consumers really care. They know they're part of a change. So I think when you repair relationships, you build sustainable systems inherently.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I wonder too about the, just the knowledge. I was having a conversation for the show yesterday around how like going up to a deli market or a butcher and like talking through different cuts of meat is a place where people can learn a little bit more about what they're eating and get to know it a bit better. And as you said, like I think the supermarket itself, when you're entering that, really divorces you from the land and the water in which most food is grown on. So for the fishers, can you speak a bit to, how you connected with different fisher families and what their journey has looked like through this as well?
Mhm. Sure. Well, so in the beginning, the first fishing family was mine. So Otto
Yes.
is actually my father-in-law, and that's why it's called Skipper Otto. And my husband, who grew up fishing, and so those were our first fish harvesters. And that first year we had 40 customers, and the second year we had 200 members. And
Wow.
wow! And Otto said to me at one point, I can probably harvest for 200 people, but what if I can't? What if we have a bad year? Just naturally and organically, we came up with the idea, well, other fish harvesters want this too. They want the connection. They want a secure, fair market to be able to keep, persist in this way of life. So we just welcomed aboard harvesters that we knew personally to fish alongside us. And that's how we initially grew. But I also recognized over time that, if we are not conscious, we can unintentionally self replicate. And so
Mm,
unintentionally, we can end up with only white, male, older fish harvesters. But that isn't representative of who fishes on this coast.
yeah.
And so we took a really long, hard look at like, what is the makeup of fishing on this coast? Who is doing incredibly, sustainable and beautiful work fishing? Who has great stories to tell? Where do we want to connect people to other communities? And so that was really an intentional piece of work that I called active listening over many years, where I would go out to the fishing grounds where my husband was fishing, listen to people, get to know people, particularly in Indigenous communities who could share the stories that go back since time immemorial of harvesting and feeding people. And so we really made an intentional effort to bring aboard fish harvesters, particularly women, particularly people. Indigenous communities, immigrant communities who had these beautiful stories and who wanted to be part of it. So I'm really proud. We have a network of 45 fishing families now. They're in BC and in Nunavut and in northern Saskatchewan. Many are in small, remote, rural Indigenous communities and who I think, bring such incredible stories and flavor and culture and language when we talk
Hmm.
production because, harvesting food is not like pulling floating dollars out of the water, right?
Yeah.
It's not, right? It's a way of life. And we did a webinar just recently with Indigenous knowledge keeper chef Jared Kwastanakan Williams, and he is an incredible speaker. He really spoke about how when people fish in communities, when they are producing food in this way, it is about language transmission, culture transmission, how naming is part of this and knowing the names of things. Talks about what he learned from his parents and grandparents, what he's teaching his kids about producing tools, mending nets,
Mm.
being in right relationship with people and environment. And that's what we support when we eat local and Indigenous harvested food, is that we are part of that culture preservation. So that's kind of what our collection of fish harvesters look like now. And that's what our members are supporting when they buy seafood in this way.
Which is pretty incredible because I can't really think of too many places where you have that opportunity to support Indigenous harvesters and really learn from them as well. I think about I was just in Ottawa last weekend and we were at the Canadian Museum of History where they have like all of the artifacts around like older fishing tools that Coast Salish people would have used. And it's always positioning this as like a practice that happened in the past instead of looking at how it is currently happening and how there's this huge cultural continuation of it as well. So I love that you're bringing those stories to the forefront in that as well.
Thank you.
So I noticed on your blog that you had posted a few different types of stories, but Indigenous fisheries in Canada face additional barriers. And I think particularly, around sometimes for non-commercial fishers, they have like very specific windows that they're given by DFO that don't always align with their practices as well. Can you speak a bit to, have these sorts of barriers been an issue for some of the Indigenous fishers that you work with and how you navigate those with them?
Mhm. Yeah, fisheries are really complex, and the relationship between Indigenous harvesters and non-Indigenous harvesters can be fraught, and has historically been, and doesn't have to be. And I think there are also lots of inspiring examples of how collaboration, co-management, these kinds of opportunities. There are so many great opportunities that the rising tide floats all boats, as they say, right? So yes, I mean, I think I'm not sure if people all understand, but First Nations or Indigenous folks who fish in Canada can fish under a number of different provisions, federal provisions. I mean, above all of that, First Nations, Indigenous folks have an inherent right to harvest that they
Mm.
never surrendered. This is their inherent right. This is protected by legislation that goes back before even contact. So those rights to fish are often then not understood, or they're contentious. Federal government has kind of managed those through a few different tools. And one of those is the provision to fish for what's called food, social, and ceremonial. And so here in British Columbia, First Nations can harvest a certain allocation of fish for their own consumption, and that they are restricted. They are not to sell that fish commercially. But First Nations can also fish under commercial licenses, as any non-Indigenous person can as well. Even within that, this can be challenging because acquiring licenses, commercial licenses, is very expensive. Licenses and boats is cost prohibitive for a new entrant into fishing, or young people, or people without a lot of capital. It's almost impossible based on how the ownership structure in British Columbia, unlike most other jurisdictions in North America, in British Columbia, you can own a license or quota as an investment tool.
Oh, okay.
And so it's a bit like in real estate, where if you can just
Oh,
buy and sell homes, the prices go up and up. And so
right.
we have this in British Columbia. There are protections in Quebec and on the East Coast that don't allow that. But in British Columbia, we have this, kind of out of control inflation of the value of these licenses. So for an Indigenous person, or for any person to get into the fishery, is so cost prohibitive. So it's really, really challenging. Federal government has also recognized the, right for First Nations to harvest for commercial, for economic reasons, as they have since time immemorial. And so there are increasingly programs that are buying back licenses from willing sellers and providing those to First Nations to create additional fishing and economic opportunities. And so there was really interesting examples too. There is the economic opportunity fisheries in Port Alberni, that's a shot, and the Hupatchisic First Nations there have a really unique, and I think an inspiring model of what's called the economic opportunity fisheries, so that by being a member of these nations, those members have the opportunity to fish commercially on certain days. That's decided in the most beautiful collaborative roundtable in that area that meets every week. And the members of that roundtable are First Nations. They are also commercial harvesters in the Gillnet and the Seine fleet, and members of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So they have a seat at that table, but they have a seat at that table, just like the other. And so in many cases, that roundtable comes up with more conservative fish harvest numbers than the department itself would have, because
Mm,
that roundtable makes the choice, hey, we're fishing for the long haul. And so
yes.
we want to protect future stocks. So we're actually going to reduce the total allowable catch. And that table also does things like they will say, the commercial harvesters will say, there's an important feast day in the nations this week. Let's give up our Monday fishing day to ensure that they can harvest for that opportunity. And then we'll fish another day next week. And so there's just a true collaborative relationship in that roundtable that I think is such a great example of how when we agree to step back from these kind of top-down decision-making models and we go into community, and yes, it can be hard. Yes, there can be disagreements. Yes. But when we persist in those relationships, I think really beautiful things happen.
Oh, that's really cool to hear about too, because I immediately think of like the overfishing, that if you're taking like a broad look at like Canadian fishers or fishing, you think of like tuna overfishing in the 1800s and like how that had a long-term effect on a lot of populations. So being able to hear about these tables shifting how we value and think about sustainability in that, for a country that is so rich with knowledge around fish and fresh waters and like these beautiful opportunities, is encouraging.
Yeah, and I think it's inspiring when people are making decisions in community about their way of life for generations.
Yes.
There's a different decision-making rubric for that, as opposed to if the decision is how do we make the most money today?
Yes. Yes. And it has like an immediate effect and community and also families and like as you know, for your family too, like the generations of fishers that will continue to be able to use the waters too.
Exactly.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about salmon because I know that's a fish that is quite adaptable, but you're doing some really interesting work with Skipper Otto where, you know, you've identified that salmon are at this tipping point. And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to how you are working with collaborators to kind of proactively change fishery management around salmon and the challenges that they face.
Yeah, it really is one of salmon are this keystone species that are not just critical as a food source, but they're critical. They're one of the very unique, one of the only ecosystems in the world where nutrients move from the ocean upriver,
Mm,
nourish
yeah.
forests and bears and eagles. I mean, it's a remarkable ecosystem. And salmon are incredibly resilient. And, there have been cases where floods or landslides completely wipe out a river. And you think, well, the salmon will never recover. And you go back, a few generations of salmon later, and somehow they have found a way.
Mm,
They overcome those barriers to become the strong, the dominant run again. And there's so many cool, fascinating biological features that salmon have that allow them to do that, that illustrate that when we get out of the way, those ecosystems are really abundant, are really powerful, really resilient, right? And so, yeah, I mean, we worry about the future of salmon. Obviously, we've seen a decline in salmon over decades here in British Columbia, and there isn't a single smoking gun. We can just, fix one little thing and say, oh, great, the salmon are fine. We've got climate change, we have ocean acidification, we have destruction of habitat because of other industries or because of, um, uh, you know, other activities upstream. There are so many things that threaten them. And we have open net pen salmon farms that are in the migratory path of wild salmon. And we at Skipper Otto feel really strongly that the removal of those open net pen salmon farms
mm,
is critical for the recovery and the resilience, the return of wild salmon, because we need to get pollutants out of their path. We need to get, if we had an endangered caribou run, we wouldn't put a cattle ranch in their migratory path.
yes, makes sense.
No, that's not a good idea, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we know this isn't a good idea. We need to get them out of the migratory path of wild salmon. So yeah, so at Skipper Otto, we really are engaged in work to raise the profile, raise awareness about what wild salmon need to survive, and to engage in political conversations and in advocacy for the kind of policy reform that we need to see to protect and to revitalize our salmon. And the thing is that the rate of change right now from climate change and these other
Yeah.
impacts is so fast. It's
Yeah.
too fast for evolution, for any species to keep up with. And so we can't just say, well, they'll adapt, it'll be fine. It's simply too fast. So we really do have to mitigate those impacts. We have to be aware. So yeah, I think a tool like Skipper Otto, a community of people who are engaged, they're buying fish for a whole year. So they're hearing stories over the course of the year. They're hearing how they can be part of change. And unlike, writing a check to a nonprofit, not that that's a bad thing, do that as well. But unlike that, you're buying fish, you're going to eat, you're going to feed yourself. If you buy fish in this way, it is a vote for change. It is being part of some change. You are supporting the world that you want to see. And you're
Uh,
also learning about ways that you can engage actively. And we've had over the years many different opportunities for our members to sign petitions around policy reform. And we've had real success where we have actually
cool.
seen, decision makers make policy change and make changes that have led to more robust local food systems. So we can have an impact by coming together as community.
Oh, that's incredible. And it makes sense to me too, right? Like I think there's almost this kind of like cloudy barrier around seafood industry in Canada where people don't necessarily feel confident in the knowledge around it or the policy. I mean, policy can always be quite daunting, but if you have those ongoing relationships and you have an on the ground sense of what's happening, it encourages and instills a more like passionate response to it too.
Yes, and I think that there is so much kind of bad news in the world, and there's so much kind of fatalistic thinking, like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. It's all this,
Yeah.
whatever. It's nothing I can do about it. My background was I was a high school teacher, and I think that because I have one foot in the fishing world and a foot in policy world, and I was a teacher, I think that one of the things that I'm able to do through Skipper Otto is take really big, complex issues like that bring them down into common language, and then create opportunities for incremental steps and change. And I think that is something we need as an antidote to this sort of disaffected, "There's nothing we can do." We need the opportunity to make incremental change as part of community. And we need that to also tackle this kind of loneliness and isolation that is
Yeah.
created by these ever more, AI and,
Yeah.
like, right? And then what's real anymore? I don't know what's real. We need real things, and you can taste it, you can smell it when it's real human connection. And so I
Yeah.
think that's what being in any kind of community, whether you're in co-housing, you're part of a CSA, you're part of a CSF, you get that. You get all of that. You are making change every day that you wake up in the morning, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's, I do a lot of like water activism out here in Ontario. And it's one of those things where it's once you get involved, it becomes less daunting. But as you said, like it's incremental change. It's not always something that affects like our attention economy right now, like
Right.
fast paced.
Instant gratification. We want fast
Yes.
and we want, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's actually just not how the world works. It's not how
No.
real change takes time, and you have to be in it for the marathon. And this is also one of the problems with our 4-year kind of political cycles is that,
Hmm.
we are almost, if we're in politics, we're almost always campaigning.
Yeah.
Real change sometimes doesn't look like the things that get you quick political wins. And so it can be really hard. And I think that's where, a true functioning democracy is where people, citizens, participate in that and apply consistent, steady pressure. This is the direction we want our governments to go. We know you need to campaign. We know you need to do those things. It doesn't matter. We still need you to keep your eye on this, and we need to move in this direction.
100%. Yeah, having that, future generations thinking is such a profoundly impactful thing in that too, right? So, yeah, I agree. For people who are new to this, I know I've had one other person come on before where they talked about like seafood mislabeling and that kind of world, which is so deeply fascinating to me, but it can also be a little intimidating for people. So what should people look for when they're making choices around what fish they're eating, be it through grocery stores or through direct buying platforms?
hmm It is so tricky, isn't it? Because,
Yeah.
if people have watched documentaries or read articles, the Outlaw Ocean podcast, there's so many great
Oh,
sources
yeah.
where you can see how, like, oh, how daunting and how bad it is, right? When
Yeah.
you learn about, there is outright slavery in the international seafood world,
Yeah.
and just devastating environmental destruction and human rights abuses. And when you learn about those kinds of things, it can be tempting to say, that's it, I'm not eating seafood.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't think, I think that's an oversimplification, and I don't think that that's the answer when especially when we're talking about protecting fishing ways of life, protecting
Hmm.
sustainable fishing as opposed to, relinquishing power to, massive offshore fish factories, these harvest
Yes.
factories. So we want to be part of something. We do have to engage, and we do have to find a way. So yeah, there are lots of NGOs, great organizations have been trying to find ways to validate and verify that this seafood is not part of some destructive, horrifying practice with varying levels of success
Mm.
from research and articles that sometimes even that's not as successful as we would like it to be. Those are starting points. They are good starting points. So I think going into a grocery store or a restaurant and looking for the Ocean Wise logo, for example, which is a Canadian program that started here in Vancouver that attempts to verify the pillars, and those pillars include things like the abundance of the stock, how much does fishing gear touch the ecosystems and environment, what's the bycatch rate like, and they attempt to capture those things. But even there, it's so challenging because we know that actually fish and fish harvesting happens in this really granular level, especially with salmon. We have thousands of salmon runs up and down the coast,
Right.
and some of them are really abundant and doing great, and some of them aren't, and that changes year to year. And how can a consumer in Ontario or wherever else, how can you possibly know? The fish doesn't say this was caught off this particular river or this run. So how do you know that? And so for an organization like Oceanwise that's doing their darndest to try to figure that out, for an organization like that to go run by run and assess,
Yeah.
I mean, that's so challenging. They do have a new rapid assessment program where they're attempting to,
Uh,
on a more granular level, run by run with salmon. So there's some great progress there. But in the meantime, what can you do? I think the important things to do are to ask questions. And even if the retailer or the restaurant can't answer the question, it applies that pressure that, oh, consumers do care about this. And it makes them feel a bit like, yeah, why don't I know that information? How could
Yeah.
I know that information? To go back to their wholesaler and say, hey, you know what? I've got a lot of customers asking how this was caught. Can you find that out for me? And then you've got the wholesaler going, well, I don't know. How would I find that out? So, you can push it up the chain a bit and to create some pressure in the meantime. So that's one thing people can do. Two things. Look for some of those labels as a starting point. Ask a lot of questions. But I think the most important thing is to buy as directly as possible. So as
Mm.
few hands in the supply chain as possible gives you the greatest chance that you actually can verify who caught this, where and when and how. And that's what, we do at Skipper Otto is it's just harvest family and the end consumer. And that's why we're able to do things like these labels
So
that
cool.
say exactly, this is my husband and one of my sons, but
Awesome.
and we can specifically say this was caught aboard the Gillnetter Eldorado in Barclay Sound, Alberni Inlet in June 2024. And it
Mm.
tells you, how long they've fished and all that kind of information. You can't really get that level of transparency anywhere else, but that's what we're trying to do at Skipper Otto is demonstrate that can be done. And it should be done, and consumers should be asking for that.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for those tips because I feel like that's something where even if people are just thinking a little bit differently in their purchase, like I know we're getting to that place with livestock in some ways. So starting to think about fish in that sense is hugely important too. So thank you so much, Sonia, for coming on today and for sharing. Do you mind sharing where people can find you online if they want to learn more about Skipper Otto?
Yeah, I would love for people to check us out. Our website is skipperotto.com. You can find us on all the socials as well with the handle Skipper Otto. If you're in major cities between Victoria and Montreal and in the surrounding areas, as well as some more remote communities, so check it out on our website. You can order from Skipper Otto in all those locations, about 100 different locations in
Oh,
Canada.
cool.
We have pickup at community partners in those towns, and we also have home delivery in lots of locations. So if people want to be part of it, we'd love for you to come check us out, follow us, follow some of our stories, come to some of our webinars, and just learn about our community. And we'd love to have you aboard.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sonia.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
That was Sonia Strobel. I've linked the Skipper Otto website and social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at my website at anthrodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthro Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out. For more Anthro, you can sign up for my newsletter at sarahdukedens.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, or Threads at Anthro Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're thinking about food. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthro is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.